Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Relations for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have with us Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. We have with us Judge Judith Hawkins, former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. And we have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a University of Maryland professor on public policy. Guys, looking forward to our conversation today. Hope we have a lot of fun with it. You know, Cuba has over 600 religious freedom violations over the past 12 months. The crackdown on religious freedom continues in Cuba, and it's following really what ended up happening with a large protest that took place in July of 2021. And now it looks like new persecution watchdog reports are tallying 622 documented religious freedom violations in 2023. And this looks like it is going to be a return to kind of hardline tactics. The Caribbean islands maintain a high level of incidents that have been taking place in the 600s for a number of years right now. And now we're starting to be even seeing a little bit more of a significant increase as you start to take a look at religious liberty organizations like the United Kingdom, organization Christian Solidarity Worldwide. But recent reports seem to suggest that this type of activity is taking place and more repressive legislation and systematic human rights violations seem to be happening. You know, Bettina is someone who's had a chance to kind of get involved in the work of religious liberty, both here in the United States and abroad. When we start to hear what's going on here in Cuba, and particularly when it looks as though not only are these issues from a religious standpoint, but there seems to be issues with Protestants, there seems to be issues with Catholics, there seems to be issues with Afro-Cuban groups. It seems like there's an issue with everyone here as it relates to these violations. What should we be thinking about this? Because I know many Americans say, well, that's Cuba, that's a communist country. But the fact of the matter is it's a communist country that's almost in our backyard. And sometimes what's happening in other people's backyards can easily transport itself into your backyard. When you hear this and see this, what is your thoughts and what should we be thinking about from individuals here in America?
Well, you're absolutely right. Cuba is in our backyard. It's just 100 miles off the coast of Florida. And as you said, since the revolution in 1959, it has had religious freedom violations, and these have sort of waxed and waned over the years. Sometimes they're more hardline, more difficult, and sometimes the restrictions are loosened. Now, what you're referring to is the event in 2021, July 11, when thousands of Cubans across the country came out to engage in protest. And it was mainly economic protest and shortages of medicines. They were protesting COVID restrictions. But this is Cuba. I mean, this is unprecedented. And so the government's reaction was to clamp down on all elements of society that they felt threatened their control. Faith leaders are seen as potentially subversive in Cuba, because surveys show that even though this government has been essentially atheistic since 1962, more than 70% of Cubans are affiliated in some way with a faith group. So faith has not been stamped out, and faith is seen as something that is dangerous to communist rule.
It seems also that they see that the faith leaders are in support of providing aid to those who are dissidents. And that kind of reminds me of the case we had a while back in Texas, where the governor was going after those who were facilitating and helping the migrants coming over. And Cuba is pulling out all the stops. One of the reports that I read says that it actually seems to be worse than it was before. The newest law passed is the right for them to take the children from the parents that they feel are not supporting the government appropriately. And that's a very scary thing, very frightening thing to lose your children. That has sounds of things that we've experienced before in history.
You know, Melissa, as somebody who's down on Capitol Hill, when you start hearing about these activities, it seems like it's a natural inclination for folk to say, well, that's not happening in my backyard. It's not really close enough to me. I shouldn't worry about it. But I think we also have kind of viewed ourselves as almost being a group that looks on things on a worldwide basis. We have our own Congress that puts out a report regarding international religious freedom activities, which means somewhere in our lexicon, this seems to have a level of importance to us. Or am I missing something?
Yeah, it absolutely does as a nation, and it should for us as individuals as well, right? And as you said, the State Department, the U.S. State Department issues this annual list, as does the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a similar list highlighting countries where there are religious restrictions or discrimination taking place. And Cuba has recently been added to that list because of the increasing discrimination that we see there. This situation is really it's really sad. It's really disheartening. As you know, Bettina said, this is really just a heavy-handed government using whatever means necessary to continue to tamp down power, and they see faith leaders in the community as people of influence and therefore potential threats to their power. But I think it's really tough, and I think that we, meaning those outside of Cuba, are doing the right things because on paper, individuals have religious freedom protections in Cuba, but obviously that's in paper only.
And that's a scary thought because what the Constitution provides on paper and in theory, when it's not a part of the society, you've got a real dissidence going on. And how do you handle it? And when the government, as in Cuba, is now threatening to take people's children, not threatening, they have actually taken some children, and they are incarcerating the religious leaders. It really, I guess, Orland does go to where's your faith and your politics? How do they work together?
I was just going to say, what can we, as those that are not part of the government system there or outside, in international organization or individuals. And I think the State Department is doing that by continuing to highlight, I think, international religious freedom organizations by, again, shining a spotlight on what's happening. And then, of course, the United States has, economic sanctions against Cuba for various reasons. And so I think we are doing the right things as well. We have, but having this conversation and highlighting what we're seeing, I think is really essential.
I hate to say this, but America may be contributing to the craziness because our economic sanctions is what's creating the economic problems in Cuba. This is kind of like a rat chasing his tail or a cat chasing his tail.
I think that's why this issue is so important. I think the reason that you're seeing a lot about it now is as we move toward whether we're going to normalize relationships with Cuba, especially when you have Democratic administration. You think about the strides that were made when Obama was there, and you saw more, at least talk and some action on tolerance, religious tolerance in Cuba. And then when the Trump administration came in, you saw another backflip. And now with Biden, you want to open up normal relations with them. It's not going to happen if people feel like there is repression going on around Cuba. The other thing we have to think about is that this is not only a Caribbean island, but it's in the Latin American hemisphere. So the largest population of Catholics are probably still right there in Cuba. And so that becomes very important. They become a voice that, America wants to hear if it's going to normalize relationships or the rest of the world. And so this is an important issue. It's not just one that's focusing on the island itself. It is in the Western Hemisphere. It's in an area where America sees itself as having a role in playing. And so therefore, what goes on that island is something that is of importance.
I think it's important to note that we're not just talking here about some sort of philosophical idea or whatever. We're talking about an apparatus, a physical apparatus of surveillance that has been built up over decades by the communist government. And, you know, the geography of Cuba itself in many ways lends itself to this repressive regime because it's a small country. It's just the size of the state of Tennessee, 11 million people there. And there is an apparatus of surveillance that is used very effectively by the government to infiltrate and to monitor religious activities. So, you know, it is such a tricky issue. You know, will economic sanctions work or will they harm? You know, will more engagement help or will it harm? You know, I see many parallels between what's happening in Cuba with what is happening also in China. I've never been to Cuba. I have visited with religious officials in China, and there is a very similar system in place whereby there is a government entity that controls all religious activities. You must be registered. And, you know, they control the interaction between religion in that country and the Western powers. So, you know, what we're discussing here is something that is just multidimensional, something that's just ingrained into Cuban life and society. You know, it's not, there's no easy fix.
But I had an opportunity to do a mission trip in Cuba just as COVID was taking place. And the question then becomes, how do religious organizations go into Cuba? And one of the things that we did in Cuba was to provide some medical care and assistance. And the lines were long, and the people needed we took glasses in particular. They needed them. They needed them because they did not have them, could not get them. And our diet was very limited because there was no food in the country. They were saying even if you had the money to buy it, it wasn't being imported. It was not there. And so how does this impact religious organizations that want to go in and help the people?
You know, Arlen, Bettina mentioned the required registration of churches in these types of countries, in Cuba in particular. And I think that's really, it's challenging or it's frustrating for one thing, as far as, you know, the effectiveness of a faith community really sort of relies on the government. But on the other hand, it really sets up potential tensions between faith groups, right? And rivalries. If you see one receiving this preferential treatment and your organization is not. And so, you know, I don't think that's accidental on behalf of the government.
I think the one thing I would say is that the difference between what's going on in Cuba and what's going on in China is that, having been to Cuba, is that the impact of the United States is greater on Cuba. So the fact that if you had a more open dialogue and trade relation with Cuba, given the impact that its proximity to America and to what's going on, I think you could start seeing a different shift there, as opposed to, you know, especially China, because its economy is doing so well. The Cuban economy is, as you've all said, there are long lines. There are a lot of things going there. So I think if we go in with, I think Obama was right in the approach that they had for the relationship with Cuba. You want to open it up more as opposed to closing it. And I think that's going to give us the religious freedom, at least more of than we see now.
I don't have to let that be the last word, but I think that's right on point. We have to figure out how to ensure that what's happening on a worldwide basis, we're paying attention to, because shortly thereafter, it could be and happening right where we live. You know, in the case of Billard versus the Diocese of Charlotte, the Roman Catholic Church is really operating Catholic schools, which is something they've been doing for quite some time. They obviously are looking at it from a two-pronged perspective, in which they want to accomplish what they would call a religious mission and providing an academic education that's robust, but they also want to make sure that they're forming students that will be, quote unquote, connected to Catholic faith. But in 2017, we started finding out that this particular organization in the Catholic Church decided that they wanted to get rid of one of their substitute teachers, who ended up coming back to sue the church because he lost his position for publicly advocating against Catholic teaching. We are starting to see that now that there is a question that comes up in how you end up determining whether or not you are trying to balance an organization being able to engage in what it believes from a religious perspective, but then juxtapose that against the employment laws and things that take place under Title VII to ensure that the work that you're engaging in is really about religion and not about discrimination. You know, Judge Hawkins, I imagine when you were on the bench, you had a chance to see a number of different cases. And one of the things that I think many religious groups have a problem with is all the exemptions and all the power that you get. For all intents and purposes, it's really a license to discriminate. So when you've got that license where you can discriminate, how do we know when they've gone too far, as opposed to just making sure that they're protecting what their religious beliefs might be?
Oh, the reason I'm chuckling is because this case has two competing issues. First of all, it's just another batter up at base on this ongoing litigation between employers terminating their employees who do not support the employer's lifestyle, i.e., we're going to talk about the Catholic education system. And the other interesting thing about this case is that Mr. Billard began teaching there in 2001 and taught until 2014. And it was in 2014 when he posted that he was marrying his partner, who he had met in 2001. And he had been working at this high school all this time as a substitute and then as a full-time teacher. And so I just kind of wondered to myself, the fact that he was gay, that everybody just kind of overlooked that little detail for all those years when he was winning all of those awards. And another fascinating thing about this case is that on the lower level, the school, the Catholic Church, did not argue the ministerial exception. Now, if we were in law school, we'd have a law school experience, and it's called What's the Black Letter Law? And the black letter law would simply be that if you're going to teach in a religious situation, circumstances or environment, you probably should support the tenets of that religious organization. That's pretty much a no-brainer. But there are always exceptions to the rule. And the exception to the rule is, I'm not a minister, but you have to involve in role modeling. You have to show to the school and the students the tenets of the church, the religious place where you're working. So that's point number one. The problem is this. Pope Francis. You see, Pope Francis is going around showing a much more gentle spirit toward the LGBTQ community. He has now said that same-sex marriages can be blessed. They can't sanctify the marriages, but they can be blessed. Kind of hard to make that distinction. He's also told parents that they should no longer condemn their children for their gay lifestyles. He calls discrimination, criminalization of homosexuality should be done away with. And so the problem, you're going to have a gay judge, a gay priest. The problem is that the church is kind of conflicted on the picture that is painting to the public. So as a result thereof, you have you have teachers being fired at Catholic schools where the community is coming out in favor of the teacher. And their lifestyles truly aren't consistent with the Catholic teachings. But right now, what are the Catholic teachings? So the Catholic Church has kind of got a problem. Okay, there you go.
So I kind of see things a little differently than the judge. As far as I think my sympathies for the teacher. First of all, he's a substitute teacher. He's not a full-time employee. Second of all, he was trained and walked through all of the requirements for what was expected of him. This was not a gotcha situation. And second of all, it's just really tough for me to find any sort of sympathy or empathy as far as why he should be surprised that all of a sudden when he did something public, whether or not the school quote unquote knew or didn't know their rights as a religious employer have been consistent throughout, right? And I think that's the situation. I think it's certainly, it's difficult. I think it's frustrating that it had to go all the way to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to actually be resolved. And I think that we are seeing more and more cases like this, particularly at the state level, whether it's actually judicial situations or legislation, where these long-standing religious protections for religious organizations, these ministerial exceptions, are being challenged. And so a lot more of these cases, as the judge said, are happening.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm just making the comment, like, I'm surprised that we're having these cases, but I think we're going to have more of them because the Catholic Church is in flux itself. And so if you're going to use the ministerial exemption, which, by the way, the school did not use, and he was a full-time teacher for a good portion. 2001, he came as a substitute. Then he went to a full-time position and only went back to being a substitute in 2014. And so I'm surprised that they're having the lawsuit, but the reason I think we're having these lawsuits is because the Catholic Church is standing, thanks to Pope Francis, is becoming kind of muddy. It's getting murky.
So I just have a couple of points or responses to that. My understanding is that the USCCB, which is the US branch of the Catholic Church, which has autonomy over a relatively large amount of autonomy over the administration of the Catholic Church in the United States, has a very clearly defined position on this issue. There is no equivocation on this. My second point is, let me give you my response as someone who has just finished paying 12 years of tuition to a religious school for their daughter. I did not pay all of that money each semester for a school to be wishy-washy on what religious values it held as important. And I think this reflects what most parents feel when they go to the trouble and expense of sending their child to a religious school. So it goes both ways. A religious institution has a very specific mission to inculcate a faith into children. That's why they exist. Otherwise, why not send all the kids to public school? And the parents also expect that. Actually, I have a third point, which is presumably this plaintiff was a legally competent gentleman who could read and understood the terms of his contract that he signed. And so, I'm with Melissa on this one. I don't have a great deal of empathy for that legal argument. There's a line of Supreme Court cases that makes it very clear that faith-based schools have the right to decide who carries their message, not secular bodies, not the EEOC, not judges, the schools.
I think if I could just jump in here real quick, I see where the judge is going, and I think she's absolutely correct. The reason you see these cases, even with the law written the way it is and people understanding it, and I'm sure it was the case in this gentleman's case, and that is, as the secular world becomes more open and diverse, it spills into the religious world, especially in teaching, where so you start testing the bounds of what is permissible and what is not permissible. This wouldn't have been a case 10 years ago. This person wouldn't have brought it. In fact, when he probably started teaching there, he had no notion that he would go out and profess, his marriage the way he is now. But the world has changed, and so you test the bounds. And I think that's what we're starting to see is that how far can religious institutions go to decide that that they want to keep it the way that if it's the Catholic Church or a Muslim church or Muslim mosque, how far can they go as opposed to how far society has gone on the opposite side? And I think that's why you see these cases come about.
And the reason I'm asking these questions are, number one, obviously he was gay at the time that he was hired. He met his partner in 2000 and he began to work at the school in 2001. And we go until 2014 when North Carolina legalized same-sex marriage. I find it just kind of hard to believe that nobody at the school was aware of his sexual orientation and his preference. And if they were, they just turned their head from it. Or more importantly, if he never bothered to put out a picture or announce publicly that he was marrying his partner, would he still have been employed? Probably.
I mean, you just think about it. He's testing the bounds there. It's not on accident that this probably came up. Mm-hmm. They probably knew he was gay when he was hired. They certainly knew it in the time he was there. But the whole notion, I think, that you're going to start to see it, not just this case, but other ones, where people are going to test the bounds as to whether, in fact, these institutions should be allowed to continue what folks view as discrimination. And that's why I think they correctly decided the case is that they had the right to discriminate against this, to keep this person from working there.
But let me throw.
I'm going to go back to, actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to the case that what the legal application has been consistent throughout as far as whether the school, so whether or not they knew since he's been working with them or not, that doesn't make a difference as far as whether they have the right now to not continue to call him for substitute teaching. Again, and going to what Dr. Baker was saying as far as sort of societal changes and sort of testing things out, I think we're now living in a world where we as employees feel more comfortable saying, no, I know exactly what the rules are, the requirements or the expectations for me are of this religious organization, but I feel like my rights trump that. And I think that's where we're at and why we're seeing more of these.
But don't forget this legal point. The church waived as a defense the ministerial exception. Don't forget that little detail there. They waived it. And as I was reading the appellate brief, it indicated that possibly they waived it, but they argued it. And so if you go without the ministerial exemption under the law, the first court, the lower court, ruled correctly. It was a discrimination case. It's only when you put in that ministerial exemption that now gives the church the authority to regulate who it will hire and who it would fire based on their maintaining the tenets of the church, at least looking like they are.
Judge, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but I think what we're going to see is a constant battle in this area simply because drawing the line between discrimination and protection of religious beliefs is always going to be a sliding scale. And whenever you're in a sliding scale, you're never going to land exactly on point. Well, Sharon Baker, tell me something I don't know.
Well, you may know this, but I didn't know this, and that is Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman elected to Congress, was elected before the 19th Amendment was passed.
Didn't know that. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
I just got back from Papua New Guinea. There was a landslide there that totally covered a village, and reportedly no Seventh-day Adventists were killed or damaged, were killed or injured in that event.
Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, so, in our last segment, we talked about sort of the secularization of society or the move away from Christianity. But that said, according to the Catholic dioceses, as in North Carolina, enrollment for their school system in that state has jumped 18% over the last 4 years. Wow. So still seems to be in the need and still going to get that tuition money that Bettina has appreciated paying.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, did you know that there are only 2 countries in the world where you cannot buy Coca-Cola? It's illegal to sell Coca-Cola. One is North Korea. The other one is Cuba.
Oh, my goodness. We learn something new here every day. Great having a conversation with you guys. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.